So with me now, I have Richard McLeod and Dr. John Fox, and we've had a few technical hiccups, as I said. So if they carry on tonight, well, so be it. We'll deal with it as we go. Just a couple of intros before we get started. Richard is a human rights lawyer, has more than 20 years' experience in immigration, refugee, and human rights law, which has included involvement in several high-profile cases, such as the Ahmed Zawi case, very high-profile case here in New Zealand. Richard is a spokesperson for Lawyers for Vulnerable New Zealanders, a group of over 200 lawyers, including Queen's counsels and prominent legal experts, who publicly spoke out against the dangerous flaws of the End-of-Life Choice Act, which legalised assisted suicide and euthanasia in New Zealand. Dr. John Fox has a PhD in English Literature from the University of Auckland. He has been an academic, worked in family and community restoration, public policy, and children's and youth work. He is the uncle and brother of adopted children. He is a son, a disabled person with spastic hemiplegia, a human being, and an Anglican minister. Welcome, gentlemen. It's great to have you with us tonight.
Great to be here.
Great to be here too.
All right, let's jump straight into it. I'll start with you, John. And because we've got a bit to get through tonight, I'm going to ask you both, because I know you're a wealth of information. Let's try and keep the punters happy with short, sharp answers, but say what you need to say.
Oh.
But I should, Reverend Dr. John Fox. It's not assuming. I've got to never bring guests that know you well on your show. That's the moral of that story. I've got an Anglican minister and a lawyer on one side of me.
Yeah, that's right. Like, lawyers don't give short and sharp. We give long, tedious, and build. So.
Right. With that in mind,
and I wasn't told that it was supposed to be short and sharp.
This is my show. You're all gone. Okay, so let's jump in. John, we'll start with you. I want you to answer this question if you can, please, for me. Do you think that this should have ever gone to a referendum? Do you think it should have gone to a referendum?
No. We had, before the end of life appeared, areas into the structure of the bill, whether New Zealanders like euthanasia in the first place, and then into the end-of-life choice. We got to Parliament, saw how complicated, how difficult, how potentially dangerous it would be. And instead of doing what they should have done, which is either to say, we think we can make this safe with more work, or to say, as I was hoping they would, this is really complicated, so let's not do it. There isn't a way of making this safe. Essentially what they did is band-aid the worst bits, get into a back room, and do a political deal. And the terms of the political deal were that they should have a referendum. I mean, essentially why we have one is that New Zealand First asked for that or demanded that as their price for supporting the bill. I was pleased that I got to cast my ballot against the end-of-life choice bill because I've been waiting to do that for 5 years. Yeah. But the legislation is so complex. What dying looks like is so complicated. Yeah. I really do genuinely believe that our politicians have abdicated their duty, and I was really disappointed to see them do that. I was there the day that they decided to do that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for principled reasons, and I'm really disappointed about that.
Richard, what are your thoughts, just briefly? Should it have gone to referendum?
No, I don't agree with that either. I think what happened here is that our parliamentarians, or at least a sizable number of them, decided to outsource their consciences to the New Zealand public when they should have really done a much better job of trying to work out whether this act was safe or not. I think most New Zealanders didn't actually really truly understand what they were voting on. I mean, that fact in itself was highlighted by Mike Hoskins just 2 days before the preliminary results. Actually, no, it was just 2 days before the referendum was held. And he said exactly that. He said most New Zealanders don't know what they're voting on. They're voting on a catchphrase.
Yeah.
They're voting on my life, my choice. They don't actually understand what this might entail.
Yeah.
They don't understand that there is going to be a price to be paid for some people's choices. So I don't think it should have gone to a referendum, and I agree with John that a lot of parliamentarians, I think, have abdicated their responsibilities. At the very least, the responsibility to try and panel beat this hopelessly flawed and dangerous bill into something that was more acceptable and more safe.
I'll stay with you, Richard. What happens now that the Act has been passed in a referendum? What is the next practical steps? Because there's a period before it actually starts happening in our country, right?
Yeah, so the Act now, I think, will come into operation a year from now, which will be November 2021.
Yeah.
And so we've basically got a year to get ready, to prepare for this. And what people don't, I think, realise, but must now realise, is that we have now legislated euthanasia as a legal right, as a valid healthcare service, as a legal entitlement.
Yeah.
And that's the same as what they've had in Canada. We actually have gone further than the Netherlands have gone, because in the Netherlands, unlike Canada, the law there doesn't actually confer on patients a constitutionally protected right to euthanasia. In fact, euthanasia is still prohibited under their criminal law, would you believe?
Wow.
But many decades of practice have inclined the Dutch public to a contrary view. They look at it as a right. But the important thing to bear in mind is that in Canada, just 4 years ago, euthanasia was legalized. It became a constitutionally protected right, a valid service. And so now the law in New Zealand is going to have to kick in, first of all, to protect that right, to make sure that every relevant government body and department and DHB has to be then brought in line with it. All of its policies and procedures going to have to be made uniform. They'll need guidelines to be issued to make sure that everybody hits the ground running. And then I suspect that government will also want to ensure that this newfound right is going to be not just protected but promoted. Okay. Bearing in mind, of course, that doctors under the law can't raise this with patients. And so how are patients going to know about it? It will have to be through promotion. So that's what I predict will happen in the next 12 months.
Okay, John, when do you think that we are likely to actually see, I guess, the practice start happening? That's one thing to legalise, but it's going to start happening at some point. And are you like me? I have a bit of a sense of dread that we are going to have all sorts of bizarre, truly abhorrent, really sycophantic media coverage of that first big case.
Yes, I think that's right. And once the shock of having had the first case has worn off, people will then get used as something which is not, which is now sayable and thoughable. We've got a year to prepare for what our response ought to be. After that, there will be very powerful voices like David Seymour, for example, who will simply stop talking about that. So they're waiting for people to get used to it, for the stigma to wear off, for people's moral unease to go away. And I expect, and I speak as a trustee of a disability charity, but also as a chaplain to the elderly. I'm chaplain at my local rest home. I expect the first cases to happen immediately. And then, as you say from Canada, the graph goes up fairly quickly.
Okay. Richard, I'll ask you this first, then John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Do you think New Zealand could actually see now the birth of what I would call big euthanasia? Basically a powerful industry with a well-funded lobby that sort of protects and shields it from accountability, that we see PR-type documentaries churned out about the initial euthanasia cases to glamorise it, etc., etc. Do you think we're going to see a form of industry, if you like, around this?
Absolutely. And just before I get into that, I agree with John before that we are going to see, we'll probably start with small numbers and gradually that will increase. And I think we'll probably see more and more media around the deficiencies in the eligibility criteria, which is going to want to expand it. But coming to the question of an industry, Very much so. What we've seen when we look at euthanasia regimes abroad is that there are key players in the industry. This is in terms of the delivery of euthanasia services. They tend to end up also being the ones that run it and that oversee it. And so what you've got, for example, in Belgium is that you've got several key players in the euthanasia industry who are actually on the Belgian Review Committee. And of course, just 2 years ago, that committee was exposed by one of its own members as being corrupt, as being guilty of covering up wrongful deaths and making sure that doctors get away with wrongful death. So yes, we'll see things like that. We'll see what they've had in the Netherlands, for example. You've got the Dutch Society for Voluntary End of Life. This is the Dutch equivalent of our End of Life Choice Society. Has become the largest and most powerful political lobby group in Holland. Yeah. It has more members, 185,000 members. It has more members than the largest political party in the country. So considerable political clout and financial clout.
And they're paid members, right? Is that right?
No, I think they're unpaid members, but they just have a lot of clout in terms of putting pressure on parliamentarians to expand the law, which is what they're doing, and also stamping out opposition to the law within the far reaches of the medical profession, concluding in more recent years with psychiatrists, because there's been a lot of pushback from psychiatrists in the profession in the Netherlands against this ever ongoing expansion into psychiatry and euthanasia deaths there. And so the NVVE, they call themselves, has been very pivotal in trying to stamp that out. So they have this sort of twofold agenda, stamp out opposition and expand the law.
John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think we'll get a big euthanasia? And also, do you think it's possibly likely that one of their pushes will be to try and, I guess, push into the world of palliative care, if you like, and almost take that in their direction, rather than obviously at the moment they want to be two separate things?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning, everybody will be very careful.
Yes.
So I'm not expecting a well-funded lobby at the very beginning. But what tends to happen, and it's happened in other countries, is that the doctors who are most careful and the most conscious of the value of life, they have conscientious objections and they opt out. Yeah. And that will be of the Hospice New Zealand. It will be true of a number of the palliative care doctors that I know. I was talking to my friend Amanda Landers about this the other day. So the people who are left administrating and running the system are the people who also get financial benefit from it. They're the people who ideologically believe in it, and they're the people who will push it. Yeah. So, already you're hearing voices in the far reaches of the disability community and also among our friends in the libertarians who will say we should integrate euthanasia with hospice. Palliative care should have euthanasia as kind of another thing in its arsenal. Essentially what that means, according to my friends who are palliative care physicians, is the death of the ethos of palliative care, which is to save life, to respect people's dignity, to tailor people's death in a way that euthanasia doesn't allow people to do. Yeah. And essentially what tends to happen is that if there is a choice between euthanasia as a thing and palliative care, which is long-term, it's expensive, it's emotionally stressful, and it requires things like overseas experts to come and help.
Yeah.
My worry is that you're going to end up picking one over the other.
John, I was going to ask you about that actually, because it seems to me we're already in a situation here in New Zealand where we know about a case personally close to us, and I know I've read articles about this recently where you've got people who have got like clearly visible physical manifestations of what appear to be bowel cancer, for example, but they still can't even get access to screening, urgent screening and things like that.
Yeah.
Now, sooner or later, surely that financial pressure is going to kick into gear here, is it not? And there's going to be, surely, even if subtle, but it's going to be a very powerful push to save money in that direction, surely.
I don't think anybody is going to actually come out and say that, for the excellent reason they'd be crucified if they did. I think what you're going to have is and this already happens to some extent in the healthcare sector, and I know this because I'm severely disabled a lot, and Elevate, which is the organization that I'm a trustee for, also does this. Essentially what happens is you have a severely disabled person and they're given treatment options, 1, 2, and 3. Once euthanasia is 4, 2 and 3 immediately become less attractive, more long-term. And there will be a subtle, not necessarily economic, but a moral pressure to say, and I know that there are lots of disabled people who already feel this. We are spending a lot of money on you. We're spending a lot of time on you, a lot of specialist time. You realize you have options.
Yeah.
And that's really all the coercion would have to be in order for somebody to receive the message. You're in the way, you're kind of annoying, and you're also blocking other people from their right. It's healthcare rationing.
Yeah.
And no one has to say you're costing too much money, although just say we will fully inform you of all your options, and then put euthanasia in front of people who already wonder about the value of their life.
Richard, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with John. I think it's probably going to be slow. I think you could probably call it a creep rather than, a rapid expansion. I think what we'll see is in the first couple of years, the numbers will be small. I think we can expect in probably years 2 and 3 to see some court cases being launched by people who are saying that this doesn't go far enough. This discriminates against me. And I'm sure that they'll be accompanied by significant media interest about whether the legislation has gone far enough. We're going to have a review of the End of Life Choice Act. The first review will be at the 3-year mark, so it's going to be 2024.
Yeah.
And in that review, the Health Ministry will then report back to Parliament on whether any amendments might be considered necessary or desirable. I think those are the words.
Yeah.
And I predict by late 2024, we'll have seen a number of court cases. We'll have more and more discussions and conversations, public conversations about whether this law is adequate, whether it goes far enough. And I think we could see some possible expansion in 2024 or after that. Coming to the point on perhaps the economic issue, I think that it is a real issue. And it's one that's never really been covered in the debates that we've had, because the supporters of the law talk about the twin imperatives of choice and, but they haven't mentioned the third imperative, which is going to be cost cutting. Yeah. And I know that that's not something we want to necessarily overtly mention in public discourse, but I think that we will be forced to mention that in years and decades to come, especially with an aging population and an economic crisis that we're entering. I think that this law does create a huge financial disincentive to a future government, maybe even this government, to continue providing funding for caring for our sick and our dying. That is inevitable. Whether it wants to talk about that publicly is one thing, but whether it puts in place policies that actually steer people away from, as John said, options 2 and 3 and more towards option 4 is another question. And I note in that regard that 2 years ago, a report was commissioned in Canada, which found that conservatively, the Canadian government could save up to $130 million a year through its euthanasia program. So, right there, you've got 130 million reasons why Pharmac and the Ministry of Health in future years are going to be particularly interested in this law.
Tell me, Richard, I'll start with you. What do you think are the most likely areas of the Act that will be quickly targeted by euthanasia lobbyists for expansion? Where are the weak points, if you like?
Oh, everywhere.
Yeah. Okay.
All of the eligibility criteria are up for grabs. They're all vague and amorphous and open to challenge. I mean, you could start just straight off with terminal illness likely to end life within 6 months. Well, why 6 months? That's purely arbitrary. So I suspect you could have someone who's insufficiently terminally ill challenging that, saying that discriminates against me. After that, you could have challenges to terminal illness itself by people who are chronically ill or who are disabled in some way and say, well, that discriminates against us. We've got possible, I think likely actually, practical expansion of the unbearable suffering criteria, most people think that that's just about physical pain. I expect that the majority of people who access euthanasia in coming years are going to do this for psychiatric or psychological reasons rather than physical pain. I also predict we're going to see advanced directives being put on the table, especially in the areas of dementia, where people who get early stage dementia just say, well, that's just completely unfair for us to be excluded from this law, because when we become eligible, we'll be incompetent.
Yeah.
And so we should be able to sign a directive now saying that when that happens, we should have our lives taken. So that's just the first. I think eventually we'll get to age expansion. That's inevitable. It's happened in Belgium and Holland and the South American country of Colombia. And I think we'll also see it eventually coming into mental illness, like we've seen in the Netherlands and Belgium.
Thomas, thank you for your comment. Thomas was watching. You've reminded me I should say to everyone, if you want to ask questions of our two panellists, Dr. John Fox and Richard McLeod. Dr. John Fox is a disability rights advocate and Richard McLeod is a human rights lawyer. Please put them in the comment section. I'll ask them. Thomas says his life goal is to die slowly, suck up medical funding. I paid my taxes. And I think we'd all agree that's a good life goal to have, Thomas. Now, John, to you, what do you have an idea on what you think might be the first area of the Act that's going to expand?
So there are two things that I think are going to happen. One is what Richard just said, which is that the various parts of the Act will begin to be interpreted more broadly. Yes. So he's talked about unbearable suffering. There's no mention of pain in that particular clause. There's also the fact that declining condition and declines in capability, that's essentially a description of disability. So I think that is one of the very likely ones. Either that clause will be interpreted more broadly to cover permanent disabilities which are not terminal. So you've just changed the definition of terminal illness through some legal sleight of hand. Or actually, the MPs at the second and the third reading were all saying, we hear your cries, people with permanent disabilities, which, by the way, means people like me, and people at Elevate, and people in the disability sector more broadly. They couldn't do that. The original draft of the End of Life Choice Bill had a permanent disability clause that basically said if you had a declining condition that caused you pain that couldn't be relieved in a manner you considered tolerable. There was a huge debate in the disability sector about that. And enough disabled people went, oh, hang on, that's me, that they had to back off that. But they've already said when they narrow the bill, in time maybe we'll come back to it. And the other marker they have already put down is age. Yeah. So the Attorney General has already said 16. 18 is discriminatory. What if it's 16? And you're going to have either disabled people with permanent disabilities saying, I have this disability. I also want to be dead. I also want to die. I also don't want to suffer. Or you're going to have very articulate teenagers. Yeah. And we have a model now for how it looks, because you have the celebrated case, like the Lucretia Seals. You have the media coverage of the celebrated case. You have the legal challenge, which may or may not work. And then after that softening up exercise, some brave member of parliament like David Seymour or Nikki Kay will put their hands up and say, we will come to your aid. Yeah. And what is actually happening there is so far removed from what compassion looks like, in my view, but it will look reasonable and moderate, and people will not. I think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, once you've got the door open, right, the wedge in the door. Richard, can you tell me, do you expect this to be legislative expansion? So from the Parliament, is it going to be case law that people bring a case and that sets a precedent, or is it just going to be in practice? So DHB is going to create policies to creatively interpret what's already there.
Oh, I think probably initially we'll see in practice. I think we'll probably see some quite expansive interpretations of the current legislation being adopted over time, just as doctors and DHBs become a little bit more confident with the process, and more importantly, confident that they're not going to be challenged about that, about those interpretations as well, and that's important to them. I think we can expect, as I said before, to see court challenges in future years. New Zealand's a little bit different to Canada. In Canada, of course, you can go to the court, into the Supreme Court, and they can actually order the government to overturn the law or to amend the law in order to bring it more in line with the Canadian Charter of Freedoms. And that's different to New Zealand. We don't have courts that can do that. But what our courts can do is issue what we call declarations of inconsistency with, for example, the Bill of Rights Act. And I think that that's going to be a real battleground in future, particularly the non-discrimination clauses of the Bill of Rights Act, for people like Lucretia Seals, the new Lucretia Seals, as I call them, people who will be coming along and saying that this discriminates against me for whatever reason. And I think that those decisions, if they do find that the law is inconsistent with the Bill of Rights Act, that's going to put a lot of pressure on our Parliament. And that's why I said before, that's important to look ahead to when the review is going to take place, because at that point in time, we might have some negative court decisions that could then be seized upon by the Ministry of Health to say, hey, look, we need to look at expanding this.
Okay, Thomas has asked about parents enabling euthanasia for minors. So basically parental consent, really, on behalf of a child, like you would with other healthcare. Richard, do you think that that's likely to happen, or is that some way off?
Well, just, look, no sooner had the ink dried on Canada's euthanasia law than doctors across the country were being approached by parents saying, look, we want to have this for our children. So that is a very real problem where parents are wanting it for some of their children.
Yeah.
And Canada has not gone there yet. It's discussed going there, and it's had a report look into this very issue of whether it should expand to mature minors. I think it is inevitable that it's going to happen. As John has pointed out, we're going to see it, but probably further down the road, I think we'll see inroads into other expansive areas before we get to that. But clearly our law is discriminatory on the basis of age. Chris Finlayson, the former Attorney General, made that very clear. In fact, he said to Parliament, you either should lower it to 16 or you should have no age limit whatsoever.
John, I would imagine this would be a concerning aspect of it for the disability community, surely, because it seems to me that traditionally throughout human history, they are the children, quote unquote, who are sort of often looked upon as, we'll help relieve their suffering by ending their lives. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's already a problem in the bill in that if you have a communication difficulty, your family can sign for you. We've already talked a little bit about dementia patients and what might happen to them in terms of advance directives and so on. But I see in my work all the time that the attitude that the country has to disability and age, and the attitude even that some parents and children and grandchildren have to their parents and to their children when they start to decline, and it's very easy without proper safeguards, which we don't have.
Yeah.
For people's attitudes to disability, for people's attitudes to age and drooling and wiping and being undignified, in quote marks, that begins to colour the decisions that they start to make. Yeah. And it's really common for already for healthcare rationing to begin to happen at district health boards when it comes to disabled people, but also for their parents to say, look, there's a case in Argentina a few months ago, look, my child is severely disabled. He's nearly 40. I've looked after him my whole life. I'm now starting to get old myself. I don't have any support or any help. Respite care is really difficult. Personal care is expensive. And you start to change the context in which people's lives are valued and the choices that are available to people. So there are already parents who say, it would be better if my kid weren't born. It would be better if it stopped. And now what we've given in the End of Life Choice Bill is a law that gives that legal force.
Yeah.
So I don't think, I agree with Richard, I don't think it will happen immediately. But I think because we're continuing down this particular road of valuing some lives more than others, inevitably disabled people are going to be at the sharp end of that.
Claire Ann Franson has made a couple of good points. She said, already as mothers we are told that it's better not to have a child, abortion she's talking about, than to have them suffer. It's a fairly mainstream attitude about child suffering. She also says, I think it's more likely to go well below 18 rather than just to 16, for example. It is more likely that people will want to show compassion, quote unquote, for very young minors because there is something truly troubling about seeing a young child suffer. And I remember actually about, was it 6-7 years ago, that there was a Dutch medical association arguing just that the law should consider the suffering of the parents having to watch a child go through an illness, and that should be grounds. Richard.
Sorry, Richard, carry on.
No. You go. Say what you're going to say, John.
What I was going to say is, if you get disabled people in a room, one of the things that we quite often do is swap stories of people who said we would be better off dead.
Yeah.
I can't count the number of times people said to me, "Oh, if I had your life and your condition, I don't know how I'd go on." You know, that kind of mentality, I think, attaches to disability quite easily, and to the elderly too. What kind of life will you have if you carry on? Yeah. And essentially, if we create a category, which we've now done, you're now only arguing about who fits inside it. So I don't think there's any reasonable way of limiting that.
Richard, we're here. Like John says, we've created the category. The law says this is going to start happening now. That's what we're with. Is there enough accountability to ensure safety, quote unquote, even what, I don't know, a relative level of safety, do you think?
Well, I think those people who genuinely want it and are genuinely eligible will get it.
Yeah.
The question is, what about those who don't necessarily want it and who are going to feel pressured or feel that they have no other choice? This is the category of people that bother me the most. And in relation to that category of people, I think that this law is woefully inadequate, as Paula Tesoriero said. It has extremely poor accountability. It has no real effective oversight mechanism to ensure the accountability of doctors and other actors in this whole process, or for preventing or detecting or punishing coercion or abuse. Yeah. And the flaws in that regard are manifold. You know, it's got no contemporaneous mechanism to oversee the process as it occurs. Unlike under the Mental Health Act, where you have district health inspectors that go around institutions and monitor the process of committal, then the registrar on assisted dying is really just a bureaucratic rubber stamping of the process. So that's not really effective. There's no appeal process for challenging decisions. It's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, for the police to prosecute alleged abuses because, first of all, the patient is dead. Secondly, the patient who is dead consented to their own death in writing. And third, how do you prove anything? You might have accusations, but how do you actually back that up with evidence? Because no doctor is going to record that they have coerced a patient, and it's going to be extremely difficult to prove that relatives have as well. So, no, I don't think there is enough accountability. And then, on top of all of that, and sorry if I go just one step further, is the secrecy of the process. Now, that's something I've just never quite understood. Why such secrecy? That we shroud this whole process with secrecy, and we deny the New Zealand public from ever knowing a whole lot of really important information about what's actually happening in this process. Who's being euthanized? What's their ethnicity? What's their socioeconomic background? Where in the country is it happening? Are some institutions doing it more than others? These are all really important questions for ensuring safety. But, could you imagine if this new law was imposing, reintroducing capital punishment? Yeah. Except we're saying, well, the whole execution process, judge, jury, and executioner is going to be done in complete secrecy. But don't worry, because one judge is going to make sure that only guilty people get executed. I mean, that's hopeless. And that's what we're going to have under this. One doctor is supposed to ensure that the patient is not being coerced. And even if it was 2 or 3 or 4, it's still not enough. It's hopeless.
Okay, so Jeanette has asked a question related to that. She said, with all of the opposition from a lot of medical and palliative care groups, do you think we'll see any whistleblowing over abuses that will be noticed and taken seriously? Or has this act been sufficiently crafted to prevent that from really happening? Richard?
I think the Act has been crafted in a way that actually prevents that from happening. Whether that was deliberate or not, we'll never know. But the reality is it's going to be very difficult for the process itself to detect abuses. I think invariably what we will see, as we've seen outside the country, is that the media, if they're interested, and maybe relatives or whistleblowing nurses or whistleblowing doctors will have to come out and be brave and say abuses have happened. And don't forget that this process will actually make it illegal for the media to name any institution or any doctor that has carried out euthanasia. And that's a real interesting gag on the media in this case, because it effectively means that if media find out that one DHB has had this enormous and unusual spike in the number of euthanasia cases in the past year, it won't be able to report on that. And that's something that the New Zealand public at the very least need to know. If there are particular parts of the country where we have seen a real troubling spike in deaths.
While we're waiting for John to come back, we've had a few technical issues, obviously, with John. He's just disappeared, as you can see. Richard, can you explain why? Is there a good reason for that gag order to be there?
No, it wasn't actually part of the original bill. And from my recollection, it was a clause that was inserted in there at the very last minute.
Yeah.
I think I've heard anecdotally that it was some kind of trade-off political deal for support for the abortion law, which was also being proposed at that time, in terms of naming institutions where these services are being carried out. And so, for whatever reason, it suddenly turned up in this law right at the very last minute before it was passed at third reading. But a lot of people don't know about that. A lot of people don't realise, gosh, I can't actually go out and whistleblow or shed light on, a really troubling practice of a spike in euthanasia deaths at the Northland DHB, for example. Why all of a sudden there are a lot of people being euthanized up there? Is it because of a troubling policy within the hospital, or is it because of socioeconomic circumstances or a poor palliative care, or is it because a lot of people up there are sickness beneficiaries and can't get Pharmac-funded treatment to keep them alive for years? All of these things are going to be really difficult to inquire into and to name names and to name institutions, and that worries me.
Tell me, Richard, then, how can people outside of Parliament, do you think, and perhaps DHBs as well, then perhaps help to bring more accountability to all of this? What can your ordinary, everyday person do to help bring a bit of accountability into this, or is it above us?
I think these are questions that we're now having to ask ourselves. We're all probably still recovering somewhat from the disappointment of seeing this law pass, especially with the numbers that it has. Yeah. But we've got time to reflect on this, and I think we've got time to really go to the discussion table with other lawyers and with other doctors. I mean, I note, for example, we've got at least 2,000 doctors in the country who are firmly opposed to this. I think that they could organise. I think that lawyers who have come out in opposition could join them. There are at least 30 psychologists who have banded together. We've got all the other organisations, palliative care organisations, hospice, NZMA, etc. So I think there's a lot of talking that could be done about what might be organised to make sure that the law is going to be overseen properly. And so we might see organisations outside of government and outside of the process become a watchdog of the process of sorts. And they may be doctors, they might be nurses, they might be community organisations, they might be some iwi in the country might have a particular interest in setting up procedures for overseeing these sorts of processes. So I think there's a lot of room for discussion, and we're going to have that discussion, but certainly in the next few months.
Folks, for those who've just joined us and you're wondering, where's Dr. John Fox? That's the question Richard and I are asking ourselves at the moment as well. We had some bad internet issues earlier on. He's disappeared. So
he's not around here.
There's hopefully nothing nefarious has happened. David Seymour's not at his house or anything. So hopefully when he's back, we'll get him back on. But in the meantime, Richard, let's just soldier on as valiantly as we can. we're living in this new reality now with this law. It's easy to sort of frame it when you talk about protecting the vulnerable previously because it was about stopping this from coming into our country. It's here now. When we talk about protecting the vulnerable in this new context, what does that mean? How do we do that in the light of a law like this?
Well, there are a number of ways that people are vulnerable under this, and I think that's what people are starting to wake up and realize. The first way in which people are vulnerable is because of the choice issue, the whole choice element of this law. Yeah. Because there are a lot of people in New Zealand, as we've pointed out before, who don't have the same choices that people like David Seymour, Matt Vickers, or John Key, or whatever might have, or you and I, for that matter. You know, people who might not be able to get proper palliative care or get the Pharmac-funded treatment they need, people who might be victims of elder abuse or lonely or isolated, and so we have to really look at ways that we can protect those people from being in a situation where their lack of choice, the lack of choices available to them, is what actually forces them to make the choice under this law for the ultimate. How quite we do that, I haven't yet sort of thought that through. But there's another way that people are vulnerable, and we've touched on this in many times in the past, and that is, you know, the pressure of overt or covert coercion and pressure from family members, for example, or from other doctors for that matter. Now, under this law, we've always argued that the coercion safeguard is wholly inadequate. One doctor is supposed to try and detect coercion in a patient. How are they going to do that? There's a two-step test, and that means that the doctor must talk to the patient's family if the patient authorises them to do that, or talk to other doctors who are involved in their care if there are any. And invariably, there may be no other doctors involved in their care, and invariably you might have, in the case of a patient who's been manipulated, a refusal to allow the doctor to speak to their family. So what does a doctor do in that situation? You might have a number of well-meaning doctors who want to help the patient, but equally they're really concerned. Is there coercion going on? I'm being denied the opportunity to really find or detect coercion. I wonder whether it may be possible for doctors or groups of doctors to put in place protocols of some sort that allow them, that they could follow for detecting coercion over and above the two-step test in this law. Whether that is unlawful or not is a question that would have to be determined. It's an offence under this law to fail to comply with a requirement of the law. Yeah. So that means they would have to adopt the two-step test for detecting coercion. But is it an offence to go one step further and say, well, actually, you know what, we're also going to ask the patient to show us their will, or, you know, find out if there are people in their family who stands to gain from their death, or conduct other sorts of interrogations or inquiries. Can they do that? I don't know, but under the health code, for example, patients have a right not to be coerced, and the question is, how far can our doctors go in ensuring that right is truly respected under this law?
John, good to have you back with us. You disappeared into the ether there. We were worried for a moment, but you are back with us, and we're just talking about what we can do. What were you going to say, John?
I said the road workers outside temporarily disconnected my internet. I had to go and tell them to put it back on.
Oh, gold. Classic. Only in New Zealand, eh?
I'm back.
we all missed you. We're just talking at this stage about what we can do to protect the vulnerable now that we're living in this new reality. It's here. And previously it was very easy to say, well, protect the vulnerable by keeping the law out. Well, now the law is here. How important do you think our local community, church groups, family support networks are going to be in protecting the vulnerable now?
Absolutely crucial. So my slogan for the whole referendum campaign has been vote no and visit grandma. And now we're down to visit grandma.
Yeah, okay.
Every person who is terminally ill, elderly, vulnerable. I mean, we already do this with young people. We're really conscious of ideas of suicidality, of making sure people's life is fulfilling, making sure people can find meaning, making sure that if there are mental health or pain issues, that they are properly addressed. And I think now we have a massive challenge, and also with the elderly and with the disabled now, to make sure that pain services are adequate, to make sure that palliative care is properly funded, whether it's expensive or not, but also to make sure that our communities are loving and welcoming and are prepared to do the hard yards with people. And it's really difficult, speaking as somebody whose job it is to mobilize volunteers to help, partly because people aren't used to doing long-term difficult things in the way that they would have been even 50 years ago, and partly because people don't know what to do. And I think we have to get a lot better at spotting people who might be isolated, at spotting people who might be dropping out of our communities, out of our neighborhoods, out of our churches, and also at tending our extended families. So I have only one grandmother left. I cherish her. If, as I am your godparent to two special needs children, make sure they hear from you. Make sure that you're around when you need to be.
Yeah.
This battle hasn't finished. It's now just relocated from the Parliament House to every single family in our country now. Yeah. If we lose people, it will be because they didn't have the social capital, the connectedness, the meaning, the support that they needed to balance the pain and the difficulty they're in. And it is a rocket science. As I said, we already do it for young people. It's now our job to fight for every life, and that's certainly what Elevate is going to try.
Good point, John. Richard, can you tell me, is there a way that we can create legal mechanisms to protect ourselves and others? Is there, I don't know, some sort of new document that can be crafted that people sign in advance to say, if you euthanize me, you get sued before they go into hospital, things like that? Are there mechanisms that could be brought to bear here?
We're going to work on that. That's all I can say at this stage. I mean, you've heard of stories of people in the Netherlands with bracelets saying "do not euthanize," and I think that they've been poo-pooed over the years as to whether they're true or not. But there are certainly going to have to be things that will need to be put in place to protect vulnerable people. But coming to the point that John was making before about what can we do through communities and local groups to protect people, I think his idea is a very good one, and I think it's twofold really. We need people outside of the process to report abuses. That's crucial. So we need communities to have their eyes, to be the eyes and ears of the process, to report abuses. But we also need communities to report problems, and there are going to be a number of problems with this process. We need to know how many Māori people are being euthanized every year, whether there are Pacifica communities, whether there are people who are in the disability community. We need to know the socio-economic circumstances of people who are availing themselves of this new service. We need to know where in the country this has been occurring and whether there is a concerning prevalence in one part of the country over another. As to where it's been going on. And this is where community becomes so important, I think, much more than the institutions under this process.
Do you think, speaking of people on the front lines, and really this is sort of doctors, nurses, probably counsellors as well, is there a way, Richard, perhaps there's some preemptive lawfare, as some like to call it, that like we saw Hospice New Zealand took a case already to try and get some clarification before it even rolled out. Is this period of a year a chance for people to think about things like that?
Yes, it is, and there may be more. I'm not sure. I'm not privy to discussions between doctors and organisations with lawyers about this, but there could well be. We've got a year. There are certainly other parts of the Act that need to be tested, because there are many parts, as the Hospice New Zealand case made clear. Justice Mellon made it very clear that there are many parts of this law which are confusing for the medical profession and which do need to be clarified. And I suspect that we could see more requests for that. This is I really feel for doctors because, and without wanting to put it a worse way, it's a really bitter pill for them to swallow because, doctors are now going to realise that they actually have no choice under this process whatsoever. For a law that professes to be all about choice, doctors don't get any choice.
Yeah.
They are forced to go along with this law. They will be prosecuted with a fine or up to 3 months imprisonment if they refuse to go along with it. They have been told that they will get criminal or civil immunity if they make mistakes. And of course, they've been promised that there is poor accountability for the process anyway. So that's the bitter pill they've been given. I know that some doctors, of course, can, through conscientious objection, choose to opt out of it. But nevertheless, when they opt out of the process, they must then tell the patient that the patient has the right to ask the SENS group, that's the group of doctors who are willing to help the patient in their lives. The doctor must tell them that the patient has the right to ask that group for assistance and the contact details of someone who can help them. Now, I think for a lot of doctors with a well-formed conscience, that's going to be a really real big problem as to whether they'll be prepared to even go along with that. So even in exercising their right of conscientious objection, they might find themselves caught. So yeah, it's a really difficult law for doctors, and I think it's going to take quite a while for them to work out what they can do and what they can't do.
We've lost John
We've
again.
lost John again.
Yeah. Well, hopefully he'll be back soon because I want to ask him a very important, very specific question for his area of expertise. Yeah. In the meantime, Jeanette Hancock has said, and so Jeanette's a nurse, obviously. Honestly, with the crap coming out of the Nurses Union and far too many of its membership, it looks like they'll be gearing up to have us do the dirty work. So that's a possibility, isn't it, under the law? Nurses or nurse practitioners?
Nurses, I believe, can administer the lethal dose. Registered nurses, but they are not the ones who can assess whether a person is eligible or not, as I understand. But yes, nurses are going to certainly be involved in this. And in fact, there's some interesting research coming out of Canada at the moment about what they call the traumatization of healthcare workers in the euthanasia process there. Healthcare workers who had no idea when they went to work that particular day that they were going to be told by their doctor that they had to go down to Ward 29 and give Mr. Smith a lethal injection, and have had to then deal with the consequences and the trauma associated with that. So that is a real problem, and nurses I think are going to have as many problems as doctors under this.
Wow. John, you're back. Good to have you with us again. Are you there, John? He is?
Yeah.
He is?
Yeah.
He's on. Oh, and he's disappeared again. Look at that. Look at that. We spoke
it's
too
a great
soon.
disappearing act.
Oh, no, he's back. Are you back? Come in, Captain. Are you there, John? Are you there? John?
He's exercising his right to silence.
Yeah, he's right to silence, mate. Well, I took that as consent, doctor, so let's bring out the injection. And he's gone like that. But this is gold. This
I hope
TV.
he comes back in time to answer this golden question.
This is live TV at its finest. He'll pop back in now, you watch. Look at that, just like that. Speak of the man himself, and there he is. Let's see. Bring him back. John, third time a charm, and you look normal again. Are you with us?
Hooray!
Okay, is this grievous and irremediable?
Ask your question quick.
Okay, here we go. There are realities here that I think churches are going to have to grapple with around funerals, surely, because for Christianity,
yes,
any intentional, deliberate act of suicide, which probably would normally be very, very few cases, because it's a mental health crisis, and we say the person's not giving their full free consent. But in this case, you got people going through a process, signing a piece of paper. Is this going to be an issue for churches and funerals?
Yes, and for every individual priest as well, or pastor or minister. I know people who are church people are supposed to be fortified against death by their faith. Actually, what tends to happen is that people either get more faithful or more fearful.
Yeah.
And part of my pastoral job at the point of death is to deal with the sources of people's fear by hearing their confessions, by speaking of the next world, by doing the things that people of faith do. Astronomically more difficult if somebody is going to intentionally commit suicide. I don't know whether I'm going to give them the last sacraments, and I can't bless their decision. Well, in that case, what can I give them?
Yeah.
And the tone of the funeral is also going to be much more difficult. It's going to be much less like dear Auntie Madge has passed to the next world, and much more like the funeral of a suicide, because that is functionally what it is.
Yeah.
Somebody has cut their life by their own choice.
Yeah.
And in that, there's an implicit condemnation on the people who have stayed behind. What could we have done? Why was Auntie Madge so unhappy? What choices did we make that might have contributed to that? That's the reality of a funeral where somebody has committed suicide.
Yeah.
And I couldn't imagine myself as a minister going to one of these goodbye parties that people have in Canada and other places, and waving off somebody to being euthanized. I couldn't do that. I can't do that.
Yeah.
And the moment of a funeral is supposed to be one of community togetherness and solidarity and kindness and faith and hope and love. And what you've got in the middle, much like with a suicide, is a dreadful fact that this person has gone by their own choice. And how people react to that is going to be dependent very much on what they believe, on what they value, and also on the strength of the community around them. Yeah. Elderly and disabled and terminally ill isolation is already a plague. We've already got a context which is many. Throwing this in is actually going to rip communities and people and families left behind up more than it would otherwise do. And it puts everybody who has to cooperate with it, the doctor, the nurse, the priest, runs the crematorium, and about what they can do and what they ought to do are the reasons why subjection is so important. It won't solve every question. And we've got to about once is going to be about how we support people, the fact that they have, and my own minds.
And I think we've just lost John again. Look at that. Into the ether. Richard, while we're waiting for John to rejoin us, I've got a question for you. Because I think this is a really important point that John is speaking to here, and I don't know how ministers are going to grapple with this, but Richard, for you, do you think there needs to be something like a hotline established, an 0800 number for citizen reporting of potential abuses? Could that even be effective?
Well, I don't think it would be. Well, would it be a government-run hotline or a community-run one? I mean,
it would have to be, wouldn't it? Surely.
I think it could be very effective. It depends because people who find out about abuses or see abuses may not know who to turn to, and so it might be a very good idea to have hotlines. I think John was just making a really good point. That obviously priests, certainly in the Anglican Church, and I'm sure in the Catholic Church as well, are going to find this very, very difficult to deal with. Not only in a pre-death situation, as John pointed out, where the person may call for a priest so that they can give their confession and so on, but also and particularly in the post-death situation, when families in the Catholic Church, for example, want to have requiem masses for their loved one, and the church is going to say, well, sorry, you're not going to have that. It's going to absolutely will pit parishioners against their priests. I'm afraid to say that is going to be a reality. And I think it's just as concerning. It's going to rip families apart because there are going to be enormous numbers of very uncomfortable and difficult and torturous discussions that will take place in families around the country about this law in respect of their own loved one in years to come. It is going to divide families. There will be people who don't want mummy to be euthanized, and there will be equally siblings who are quite happy for her to do that. So it is going to be a great divider.
That's a good...
And there, you've got the genuinely practical problem. Like if it were a 25-year-old rugby player who said, "I'm going to kill myself," nobody would throw them a goodbye party.
No.
Nobody would say, "I validate your choice." No priest would say, "I'm going to give you the last rites," or "I'm going to celebrate at your funeral the validity of your choice." To do that for the death of somebody who's terminally ill or elderly, I think says really ugly things about how we value people who are weaker than we are.
Richard, sorry, and John, speaking to that point, Jennifer Grace says that goodbye parties thing sounds like something from a sci-fi movie, more like a horror movie, probably.
Oh, it's real.
It's absolutely real. I mean, it's bad when David Seymour said, "Well, that's kind of creepy."
Yeah.
He wouldn't go to a goodbye party.
If anyone has the stomach for it, and it really serves as a great warning, I think, is there was a documentary in the Netherlands, wasn't it, a couple of years ago, where they followed the process with a woman, and she had the party, and then they give her the drugs, and they filmed the whole thing. And it's such, you look at it and you realise this is extremely dark what's going on here. This is not, no matter how much they dress it up, it is not a normal, humane thing to be happening at all.
No. Yeah, there was a video posted, as you probably remember, Brendan, a year or two ago of a man in Canada who I think had advanced diabetes, and he was told that he was about to lose his leg, and he decided, well, that's the end of it for me. I'm not going to go ahead with the amputation. I think I've lived enough of my life, and I'll go ahead with euthanasia. Threw a big party, invited everybody along, and then he insisted on there being all sorts of music, and then a big round of applause as the lethal injection was administered. And that all of this was recorded. And it was one of the more dark and disturbing things that I've watched, and I kind of wish I hadn't. Yeah. But there you have it. That's how some people are celebrating their life, their choice in Canada, while there are many other people in Canada who are extremely vulnerable, who are being pressured into the process that we don't hear about.
John, I guess you could speak to this too, that in families already, even without euthanasia, it's just delusional to think that everyone sees death and dying in those moments in the same way. You think about the siblings and the children.
Yes, that's right.
There's going to be family warfare over this, surely. Those who want it, those who don't.
If you think about the kind of family wars that I already see in my chaplaincy job, about whether mum should go into a home or what her care should look like, or how much it's going to cost, all of that stuff. But now we've got something that's life and death. I mean, the same human nature will happen, the same family disputes, the same genuine bitterness. It is one of the principal parts of my job is to advocate for people's care, principally with their families who don't come to see them.
Yeah.
And to say to people, well, no, your mother isn't dead. If she's not a child, she has a dignity and a life still, and she'd quite like to see you, actually. And the same with family disputes. You hear quite often in my job, I had a fight with my daughter, I had a son. The same kind of family you have around funerals anyway are going to be astronomically more bitter, angry, and larger consequences, because this is conversations that we can't take back, things that doesn't have an off button after someone on.
Yeah,
you can't undo a mistake, and you can't somebody end up by saying, well, we love you very much. I still think that's a fundamental mismatch.
John,
if somebody's life isn't worth living.
John, while we've got you here, Chanel Shaw has asked, what are the resources we should be sharing with our elderly in the church, places to get help and counselling, etc. Now that we're past facts, how do we ensure they know their value and the notions of care?
So there will be organisations that start to opt out. Hospice has already announced they'll do that. Elevate, which is the charity I've got, passed a motion yesterday saying we won't cooperate. So what we need and what we're in the process of formulating is a list of safe organisations where it is safe to have care. I expect church hospitals to do the same.
Yeah.
And there is a list already of safe doctors in the Doctors Say No letter. So the first thing I did after the euthanasia law passed is I Googled the Doctors Say No letter and I checked that my local doctor is on it.
Yeah, awesome.
And as it happens, he is. Well done, Dr. Felix Rupel. You did great. So I am not going to change my medical practitioner.
Yeah.
But if he wasn't on the Doctors Say No list, we would have had to have a conversation that began, am I safe coming here? If you're going to consult on my care, I insist that you don't cooperate in this ideology. And if you are going to, I want someone else. So for a start, I think you're going to see people nail their colours to the mast. Take note of the safe people. Take note of the organisations which have already said no, and the ones that will over the coming months and years. But also, we've got to do what is essentially good suicide prevention. So one of the things that I'll be doing in my parish is we'll make a list of people, not people who are terminally ill, because we've only got 2 of those out of about 300, but people who we think might be a bit vulnerable, people who might be a bit lonely, people whose families are far away, people who have various long pastoral difficulties. I mean, this is the sort of thing that priests do all the time anyway. And we'll be developing special attention to make sure that they're looked after, that they're connected to people, that they're seeing people regularly and they're being visited. And there'll be a few with specialized needs who might need some kind of medical guardianship or other help that the church can help provide.
Yeah.
And I would urge people who are listening to this, like if you voted no, your job isn't finished.
Yeah.
Think about the people you know, the people in your street, the people in your family, the people in your church, the people you're connected to, and don't assume that someone else will drop in on it. Yeah. One of the things that we have to do is, if you voted no, the vulnerable have now become our problem in a way which it's so easy to be paralyzed by. What are we going to do? The system is so big. What can we do? Well, you start with the people you know.
Yeah.
You start with making sure that people have meals, that people have visits, that people are looked after. And one of the great joys of my work in both the sectors, actually, in the disabled and the elderly, is the difference that really small things make.
Yeah.
The difference that somebody holding your hand and saying hello, and making sure that you have your lipstick on and that you can go outside and see your garden and things like that. It makes a to not only to lift people's spirits, but to give us things to do which aren't necessarily political.
Yeah.
Think about people you know, ask what they need, and if you don't know, ask them.
Yeah.
We love you. We want you to be looked after. Is there anything you need?
Yeah. Great point.
Oh, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think everybody's disappointed with what has happened, but I don't think we have to be discouraged. We have fought, John and I and you, Brendan, and many other really great people in our different professions and communities have fought long and hard against this law for many years now. Okay, we haven't succeeded. In the words of the law itself, we've done our best to try and stop it, but we have failed to do so. But now the challenge, as John has said, is for us to do our best and shift that into other areas. And I think the key now is for us really to ensure that the wrong people don't get euthanasia, that vulnerable people are protected from it, and I think to ensure that the process is properly watched. And I think that there is just so many options available to us on those fronts. And I think we can do that really positively and boldly. And I think we could, you could actually create some really, really effective community, religious, professional watchdogs that really give this law a good run for its money.
That's awesome. As Claire Ann Francis just said, they've opened the supply. Let's work on cutting the demand. John,
Point.
Give the girl a mic.
John, are you still with us there, John?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
here.
Tell me. I'll leave the last word with you. Now, Richard, being a lawyer, is probably not going to like that, but I'll leave the last word with you, John. What about people who might be feeling a little bit discouraged by the way the vote has gone?
I would say fear not, but be prudent.
Yeah.
So I was massively discouraged for the first week. We've all fought really hard, but now the battle is shifting to stuff that we can actually impact. I couldn't change the minds of some of the MPs because they were fairly determined. But I can make sure that the people in my street are looked after. I can make sure that my parish is a welcoming and loving place. I can make sure that we do everything we possibly can to assure people of the value and the dignity of their lives, and to advocate for people who can't do that as much as I can. And I think rather than being discouraged, look for the people you know who might be vulnerable, and make sure that if they do make that choice, if they are going to do it, that they don't go with nobody offering them alternatives, with nobody saying how much they're loved, with nobody saying we want you to stay.
Yeah.
We value you. We love you. You will go to that death chamber over my dead body.
Yeah.
Awesome. That is the work which is too big for one person, but which a church and a community and a neighborhood and a street and a family can do. And that is the work that we're all called to now. Fight for every life.
John, that was excellent as always. Richard, John, thank you both for being with us here tonight. It's been a really, I think, an awesome and very fruitful discussion, despite the technical glitches. So
sorry, everybody. The
right.
nice construction man says, sorry, we didn't tell you. So, you should be deeply comforted by that.
We aren't. But no.
Well, I am sorry to everybody. I have not moved this whole time.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Stay there. Don't go anywhere. I've just got to deal with a few things, and then we'll have a chat once we're off air. But again, thank you both for coming.
God bless.
Thanks for having us.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future